Towards the end of 2016, we're hearing from people you might crudely describe as winners and losers. Last night it was two people who successfully campaigned for a leave vote in the EU referendum and for a Donald Trump election victory. Tonight, a conversation with the people on the opposite sides of those campaigns. Lucy Thomas was a senior figure in the Remain campaign, Britain Stronger in Europe. Lucy, tell me a little about what you did.
I was the deputy director of the Stronger In campaign, the campaign for us to remain in the EU, and one of the core team really to build that campaign from scratch. So I commissioned some original research to look at where was public opinion right at the beginning, back in March 2015, and then built the brand, our messages, really figuring out how on earth are we going to persuade people to stay in the EU, given that they don't have any affection for it. If they do know the positives, it's quite vague. It's probably about the economy, but they certainly knew the negatives. And that was all about it costing a lot of money, it being overly bureaucratic and so on. And then as the campaign went on, I was one of the spokespeople for the campaign, and similarly to Shifra, went around the country talking to lots of people. And I agree that on that point about it being democracy in action and talking to people. But for me, it was almost the opposite reaction, because the more you spoke to people, the more you understood that they really didn't like the EU, that there were lots of negatives. There was a real sense of passion about wanting to vote to leave. But with the Remainers, I'm not entirely sure that passion was ever really the same outside of London.
So I'm guessing there's no point in asking you if you had fun. It sounds like a bit of a grind.
At times it was pretty hard. There was one particular event which had an audience of mainly UKIP members who were heckling me throughout, lots of shouting, lots of abuse on social media. It wasn't that fun, but as with any campaign, you end up in some quite funny situations, and you're travelling around on a bus and all the rest of it is quite funny. Where Trump was quite clever in exploiting Brexit was to bring Nigel Farage and show, look guys, we can do this revolution ourselves too. So I think in showing that it's possible to shake the establishment, the status quo and all the rest of it, he knew exactly what he was doing. I agree with the polls. Actually, there was always, throughout the campaign, this real disconnect between what our polls were showing and what people believed. So there was consistently, throughout the campaign, around 70 to 80% of people assumed we'd stay in, come what may. And the reality was, our first polling back in March 2015 showed us just about winning, around 52-48. But when you looked at turnout, it could have been 50-50.
And as you approached polling day, with all that information you had, but being a very public face of the campaign and having to be positive and so on, what was your gut telling you? I know what you hoped would happen, but at 3 o'clock in the morning, if you woke up, what were you thinking?
It varied. There were definitely times where I was certain we were going to lose. And that was partly when I spoke to people around the country and you felt that passion, and people knew and could articulate all the negatives. They had all of the numbers of the Leave campaign. They knew it was £350 million a week for the NHS and so on. Whereas for our side, it wasn't quite that passionate. But then there were times when it would pick up and I'd think, no, it's okay. I mean, there were points where I thought, oh, this is going to be a problem, was when there was a net migration figure that came out showing the government had missed its migration target by 3. So it was 3 times over what it's meant to be. And that real sense of momentum of, well, the only way we're going to take back control of migration is by voting to leave. And it was very hard for us to get the narrative back again in our direction. And actually quite the opposite to Shifra in terms of our opponents. There was a big moment when Boris Johnson said he was going to campaign to leave. And again, in the pit of my stomach, I actually had to go on TV sort of 10 minutes after he'd announced and say, it's all fine, actually. It's much bigger than just one person. Everybody has a vote. It's not just about politicians. We've got loads of fantastic people on our side. But inside, I was thinking, right, this is going to be so much harder. There is that moment where your heart just sinks. And for us, similarly, it was that first result. It was Newcastle, which came first. And we'd got over the line, but it was nowhere near what we needed to get. And then Sunderland, and it was just these thumping wins for Leave.
And instinctively, Shifra's the strategist, and she knew, she had it in her gut right away that it was going wrong. Are you would you cling on to hope? Would you say, well, maybe Newcastle isn't quite, maybe the next one? Or where were you emotionally with all that?
Right at the beginning, actually, because if you think about the context as it was, nobody really thought we'd lose, even if everybody knew it was close. Nigel Farage had already conceded very early on. The sense really was, well, we can't lose even if it's very close.
Plus, there was nothing to compare it to, unlike US elections or British elections. This was a one-off, so you couldn't look at previous results and make a judgment.
Yeah, and really, looking at our strategy, we knew very well that there were lots of areas. And in fact, we'd planned for the night and we knew that lots of early results would show us losing a lot. And we knew that there were these core areas which would vote Remain, that hopefully would be enough to make it up by. So therefore we knew London, Scotland, Northern Ireland, they really had to turn out. And then, but fairly soon actually, once those original results had come through, we just kept being a bit short of the mark. And we had a model which Jim Messina had done, who'd also worked on the Hillary campaign, I think, and worked on Obama's before. And so we knew what 50-50 would look like. So we knew precisely what we needed in each area, and consistently we were just falling short. So all of our internal conversations, we'd be sort of trying to keep each other positive.
You had a few Floridas. We're going to get Florida.
Exactly. But then, the reality dawns, and in all of our conversations, it was just, well, gosh, this is going to be tight. And then it's, we can't actually do this, can we? And when do we have to realistically start thinking about it? And colleagues would be doing interviews throughout. And, in the beginning, it's fairly easy because you can just say, well, we've only had a few results. Let's see what happens. The night's young, etc. But then as it goes on further, that becomes harder and harder and harder. And then we knew ITV actually were the first to say they're going to call it for leave now. And at that, I just burst into tears. I couldn't keep it together, so I just hid. I went out of the main room and was just hiding around the back because I thought I can't let my colleagues see me. And also, for all the people who'd put so much into it and volunteers and everybody who was filling that room. These were people who'd worked on the campaign throughout and had just put their heart and soul into it. And that's what you feel is just, oh my gosh, for all these people who've worked so hard, what else could we have done? And it was just very, very difficult.
Lucy, how do you reflect on the result and everything it means?
Well, I think you go through all the different stages of grief, really. And I think in the beginning, for me, one of the main reasons I was involved was because I genuinely didn't see an alternative that was better. It would only be worse if we were to leave. So when you start seeing the pound plummeting, market turmoil and so on, you think, well, this is actually happening. The things that we feared were going to happen, they are happening. And just how bad is this going to be for the country? You just feel powerless and guilty, actually, and you rack your brains and think, what else could we have done differently and so on. And in the months that have been, almost 6 months now, one of the other things I felt throughout the campaign was this anger that the Leave campaign didn't put forward a specific plan. And, they've been honest about that they didn't want to be pinned down to a specific plan. And so to now not know what's going to happen and not know what it's going to look like, I absolutely accept the result. And I genuinely do hope that we end up with a better deal than we did have inside the EU. I find it hard to see how you do that when you've got 27 other countries who definitely don't want you to have a better deal. But let's see how it goes. But I do worry about how it ends up.
That's Lucy Thomas, part of Britain Stronger in Europe.